You ever find yourself in a moment so absurd that your brain can't decide whether to laugh or call a lawyer? That's exactly where I was standing one chilly Saturday morning, tightening the final bolt on a 6-foot cedar fence that now ran perfectly straight through the middle of our neighborhood lakefront. Grass, dock, water, all sliced clean in half like somebody had drawn a line with a ruler and said, "That's it. That's the boundary." Behind me, about a dozen neighbors had gathered in stunned silence. Nobody was saying much, just watching. Some had coffee cups frozen halfway to their mouths. Others were whispering like they were witnessing the start of a reality show. Across the fence stood the woman who had caused this entire mess. Except now she looked like someone had unplugged her brain. Her name, well, it used to be Veronica Dale, but around here people just called her Queen V. And behind her, stranded on the wrong side of my brand new fence, sat about $15,000 worth of patio furniture, tiki torches, a giant outdoor speaker tower, and half of a custom jet ski ramp she'd been building for the past month. Yep, half, because the other half was now on my side of the fence. She just stood there staring at it, mouth open, like the concept of property lines had personally betrayed her. And honestly, the craziest part of that morning wasn't the fence. It was how 5 years of small, petty power plays had finally boiled down to this one ridiculous moment. Because none of this would have happened if it weren't for one person. Our HOA president. Let's call her Linda Harper. Now, when I first moved into Pine Hollow Shores about 5 years back, the place was basically suburban heaven. Quiet little community outside Greenville, South Carolina. Nice houses, kids riding bikes, people grilling on weekends, and the main selling point was the lake. Technically, the lakefront area was shared access between 6 houses on our street. Nothing fancy, just a sandy stretch of shoreline, a wooden dock, and a few picnic tables. But for my family, that lake was everything. My son learned to fish there. My daughter took her first swim there. Summer evenings we'd sit out on the dock watching the sunset. You know, the kind of small moments that make a house feel like home. And for 4 years, everything worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Until Linda Harper became HOA president. Now listen, every neighborhood has that one person who suddenly gets a little authority and treats it like they just got sworn in as supreme leader of the suburbs. Linda was that person. First it was small stuff. Grass slightly too tall, $50 fine. Wind chimes, noise pollution. Someone painted their mailbox navy blue instead of HOA-approved charcoal gray. I swear to God she wrote a 2-page violation notice about it. But the real problem wasn't the rules. It was who the rules applied to. Because Linda had this interesting habit of bending them for certain people. Her brother suddenly became the landscape compliance inspector for the HOA, paid position, of course. Her best friend got the pool maintenance contract. And then, about 6 months ago, her cousin moved in. That cousin was Veronica Dale. Now Veronica didn't technically own property here. She was just staying in Linda's house while figuring out her next move, which apparently meant turning our shared lakefront into something that looked like a beach club in Miami. The first time I noticed something was off was one Saturday morning. I walked down to the lake with my kids and stopped dead halfway across the lawn. Because where the shared shoreline used to be, Veronica had set up what looked like a private resort. Massive lounge chairs, a propane fire pit, 6 tiki torches, a giant Bluetooth speaker blasting music you could probably hear 2 counties over. And right in the middle of it all, a half-built wooden ramp sticking out toward the water. Jet ski ramp. Now remember, this wasn't her property. This was shared space. So I did what any normal adult would do. I walked over, introduced myself, kept things polite. "Hey there," I said. "Just wanted to mention this part of the shoreline is shared access for the houses here." She looked at me the way a queen looks at a peasant who just spoke without permission. Then she slowly reached into her beach bag and pulled out a sheet of paper. "Well," she said, waving it in front of me, "Linda reassigned this half of the lakefront for my exclusive use." HOA decision. Exclusive use. For shared land. Because apparently the HOA had decided that since my family mostly used the lake on weekends, Veronica deserved weekday access. I took the paper from her and looked it over. It claimed the HOA board had unanimously approved a temporary easement reassignment for community efficiency. Now, I'm not saying it was fake, but 2 of the board members listed on that vote were in Arizona at the time, and one of them had moved out of the neighborhood 3 months earlier. So yeah, something smelled funny. I decided not to argue right there on the lawn. Instead, I made a few phone calls. City Planning Office, County Property Records. And within about 20 minutes, the whole situation started looking a lot less like HOA policy and a lot more like someone playing make-believe with legal documents. Because according to every official record I could find, the lakefront wasn't HOA property at all. It was deeded shared access between the homes, which meant Linda's little exclusive rights paper was about as legally powerful as a sticky note. Still, I figured I'd give them the benefit of the doubt. So at the next HOA meeting, I stood up and calmly explained what the county records showed. And Linda lost her mind. Her face turned bright red. She slammed her hand on the podium and started yelling about how the HOA had recently amended the bylaws to give full control over waterfront management, which was interesting because nobody in that room remembered voting on that amendment. Then she pulled out another piece of paper, no meeting minutes, no signatures, and announced that anyone interfering with board decisions could face a $500 daily fine. $500 per day. At that point, most of the room just sat there blinking. But Veronica? Oh, she loved it. Because over the next few weeks, her little lakeside empire kept expanding. More furniture, more speakers, more guests. And that jet ski ramp grew bigger and bigger until it stuck out into the water like a wooden middle finger to the rest of the neighborhood. But the moment everything finally snapped was one Tuesday morning. My 8-year-old daughter walked down to the lake for her usual swim, and Veronica physically stepped in front of her, arms crossed. "Private area," she said. My daughter came back up the hill crying, and I stood there watching her wipe her eyes, realizing something. This wasn't about furniture anymore. This wasn't about noise. This was about someone abusing power and assuming nobody would push back. And the funny thing about that assumption is sometimes it works, until the wrong person decides to read the fine print. Because what Veronica and Linda didn't know was that my job involved contracts. Lots of them, which meant that week I went digging. Property survey, purchase agreement, HOA charter, 30 years of archived meeting records. And the deeper I looked, the more obvious it became. Not only did the HOA have zero authority over the lakefront deed rights, but interfering with them could open the board to personal liability. And that's when the idea of the fence first popped into my head. Not out of anger, not even revenge, just clarity. Because sometimes the simplest way to end an argument is to draw the line. Literally. Now, before we jump back into the chaos with the fence, let me pause the story for a second, because this situation actually hits on something that a lot of homeowners in the US run into with HOAs, and most people don't realize how the rules actually work. See, according to standard procedure, a homeowners association can regulate things like appearance standards, shared amenities, landscaping rules, parking restrictions, stuff that keeps a neighborhood uniform. That's their lane. But deeded property rights? That's a completely different animal. From a legal perspective, once a property right is written into a deed and recorded with the county, an HOA board can't just vote it away during a Tuesday night meeting with a clipboard and a bad ATT. It should. Changing something like that usually requires formal amendments, recorded documents, and in many cases approval from every property owner involved. In other words, Linda wasn't just bending the rules. She was pretending they didn't exist. And there's another layer to this, because what Linda and Veronica were doing is actually a classic power dynamic you see in small communities. This is a psychological trap. When someone gets even a tiny bit of authority, HOA president, neighborhood committee chair, whatever, it can create what psychologists call micro-authority syndrome. They start believing their role gives them control over things that were never theirs to control in the first place. Most neighbors don't challenge it, not because they agree, but because they don't want the hassle. And that's exactly how situations like this escalate. Because once someone realizes nobody is pushing back, they start pushing further, which is precisely what Veronica did. And unfortunately for her, that's when I started planning phase 2. So once I finished digging through the paperwork, the picture became crystal clear. The lakefront was split evenly between the 6 properties that bordered it. The survey maps showed the exact boundary lines running straight through the shoreline and extending into the water. And the HOA charter? It literally had a clause, buried about 12 pages in, that said the association had no authority over deeded access rights, which meant Linda's little, exclusive lakefront assignment wasn't just questionable. It was completely meaningless. So I did the reasonable thing first. I drafted a notice. Nothing dramatic. Just a clean, professional letter stating that the area Veronica had occupied included property I held deeded rights to, and that her structures, furniture, and ramp were obstructing that access. I gave them 72 hours. 72 hours to clear their stuff from the shared boundary, or I'd take further action. I sent copies certified mail to both Veronica and Linda. Now, if you've ever dealt with people who thrive on power games, you already know how this part went. They didn't take it seriously. In fact, the very next morning Linda showed up at my front door with Veronica and a guy she introduced as their attorney. Now, I'm not saying the man wasn't a lawyer, but if he was, his legal education may have come primarily from binge-watching courtroom dramas. Linda started the performance immediately. "You're harassing members of the association," she snapped, waving my notice letter like it was contaminated. Veronica stood beside her with arms crossed, glaring like a teenager who'd just been grounded. Then the attorney cleared his throat and launched into something about community governance authority and implied easement usage. I let him finish. Then I asked one simple question. Which county record shows the HOA owns the lakefront? He blinked, looked at Linda, looked at Veronica, then mumbled something about reviewing documentation. That's when the tone shifted. Linda suddenly started trying a different tactic. "Well, maybe we can work out a compromise," she said. And this is where it got ridiculous. Veronica suggested a schedule. Monday, Wednesday, Friday the lakefront would be hers. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday we could share. Sunday would rotate. I just stood there staring at them. Because the level of entitlement required to schedule usage of land you don't own, that's a special kind of confidence. Then Linda sweetened the deal. She offered to waive my HOA dues for a year if I dropped the issue, which told me everything I needed to know. They knew the paperwork was garbage. They were just hoping intimidation would work. So I thanked them for stopping by and reminded them they still had about 60 hours left on that notice. They left in a huff. And then something funny happened. Instead of backing down, Veronica doubled down. Over the next couple days, she added even more stuff to the lakefront. More lounge chairs, another speaker tower, and she started building a permanent shade pavilion. 4 wooden posts sunk into the ground, 2 of which were very clearly on the boundary line, which meant part of the structure was on my side. At that point, the 72 hours ran out, and phase 2 began. First thing Monday morning, I hired a licensed land surveyor. Nice older guy named Carl who had been mapping property lines in the county for 30 years. When I explained the situation, he just chuckled. "Let me guess," he said. "HOA president with a cousin?" I nodded. "Yep, seen that movie before." Carl spent the afternoon measuring everything and placing bright orange boundary markers along the shoreline. And sure enough, Veronica's little beach resort had spilled across both halves of the property. When she saw the markers go in, she stormed down yelling that Carl was trespassing. Carl didn't even look up from his measuring rod. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "this is a licensed survey." She turned bright red and stomped back toward Linda's house. Now here's where things started getting interesting. Because word travels fast in neighborhoods like ours. By that evening, half the street knew a survey had been done. People started coming by casually asking questions. "Hey, I heard something about a property dispute. Did the HOA really try to reassign the lake?" I kept my answer simple, just clarifying boundaries. But inside, I was already moving to the next step. That afternoon, I drove to the hardware store, and I ordered enough cedar fencing to build a very clear, very straight, very undeniable line. The guy at the counter raised an eyebrow when I told him where it was going. Across the lakefront. Yep. Through the dock too? Especially through the dock. He just shook his head and started ringing up the order. By the time I got home that evening, the rumor mill was in full swing. Apparently, Linda had already started telling people I was planning to destroy community property, which technically wasn't wrong. The dock was shared, but the property line still ran right through it. And if Veronica insisted on treating the lakefront like private land, then I figured I'd treat it exactly the same way. Sunrise the next morning, the fence crew arrived. Truck, post auger, stack of cedar panels. We had the survey map. We had permits. And we had a very specific line to follow. The first post went into the ground right at the edge of the beach. The auger roared to life. Dirt flew everywhere. And within minutes, the base of the fence was set. By the time the third panel went up, Veronica came bursting out of Linda's house wearing a bathrobe and holding a coffee mug. She froze halfway down the lawn because the fence line was heading straight toward her furniture. "What are you doing?" she screamed. I held up the survey map, marking the property line. Her eyes went wide. "You can't build a fence here. This is shared property." "Exactly," I said, half shared. Then the crew kept working. Panel by panel, the fence stretched across the sand, through the grass, straight toward the dock. That's when Linda arrived, still in curlers, yelling before she even reached the shoreline. "This is vandalism. This is illegal." She pulled out her phone and started dialing. First the police. 2 officers showed up about 15 minutes later. They reviewed the permits, the survey documents, and the property records. Then one of them shrugged. "Looks like a civil matter." And they left. Linda looked like she might explode. Next she called city code enforcement. Inspector showed up, walked the fence line, checked the permit. No violations. Then she started calling everyone she could think of. City Hall, county office. I'm pretty sure at one point she tried contacting someone at the state level. Meanwhile, the fence kept going up. And the best part? The dock. The property line ran straight through the middle of it, which meant the crew installed a post directly through the planks and built the fence right down the center. By the time they finished, Veronica's entire setup had been sliced in half. Half the jet ski ramp was now useless. Her massive speaker system had 1 tower on each side of the fence. And the shade pavilion? 2 posts on my side, 2 on hers, which meant the structure was now completely unusable. She just stood there staring at it, face pale, like reality had finally arrived and she wasn't ready for the meeting. That night Linda called an emergency HOA meeting. She sent flyers around the neighborhood claiming I was endangering community harmony. But when people showed up, something unexpected happened. Instead of attacking me, they started talking. A retired judge on our street, Tom Whitaker, stood up first. Calm voice, very polite, and he explained, step by step, exactly how Linda had violated the HOA charter. Then a woman named Dr. Emily Park spoke up. Turns out her flower garden had been bulldozed earlier that year because Linda claimed it violated landscaping rules. More neighbors followed. Stories started piling up. Questionable fines, strange contracts, money being funneled into projects run by Linda's relatives. Then the final twist walked through the door. Veronica's husband. Apparently, he had just flown in from Chicago and driven straight from the airport after hearing about the situation. He stepped into the meeting room, looked at the fence photos people were showing around, looked at Veronica sitting there fuming, and just sighed. "Pack it up," he said quietly. "What?" Veronica snapped. "We're leaving." The room went silent. He explained that Linda had convinced them the HOA controlled the lakefront and that nobody else had rights to it. Now that he understood the legal situation, he wasn't about to get dragged into a lawsuit. The next morning, their furniture started disappearing from the shoreline. But Linda? She wasn't done yet. At the end of that emergency meeting, she tried one last move. She declared an executive HOA order demanding the fence be removed. That's when the association's attorney, who had been sitting quietly the entire night, finally spoke. And his words were short. "Madam President, you've exceeded your authority." He explained that Linda had not only violated the charter, she had exposed the HOA to serious legal liability. Then he recommended something nobody expected: immediate removal from office. The vote happened right there. Unanimous. Linda Harper was out. But that wasn't the end of it. Because once the financial records were reviewed, things got a lot worse. So once Linda was voted out, the dominoes started falling pretty fast. Because when a board president suddenly loses power, something interesting happens. People start looking at paperwork they probably should have examined a long time ago. The new interim board requested a financial audit of the HOA accounts. At first it was supposed to be routine, just a quick review to make sure everything was clean before the next election. Except it didn't stay routine for very long. Within a couple weeks the accounting firm came back with questions. Lots of questions. Payments labeled Community Shoreline Improvements. Invoices signed by companies that, oddly enough, were owned by Linda's relatives. And the biggest red flag of all, the legal paperwork Linda had used to justify Veronica's so-called lakefront easement. Turns out the HOA had paid several $1,000s to draft that document. Except the lawyer listed on the paperwork had never actually written it. Yeah, that part got real awkward real fast. The board turned everything over to the county. And about 3 months later, Linda found herself standing in a courtroom instead of a homeowners meeting. fraud, misuse of HOA funds, breach of fiduciary duty. Now, I'm not going to pretend this turned into some dramatic Hollywood trial with gasps and dramatic speeches. It was actually a lot quieter than that. Just a judge reviewing the evidence, asking a few questions, and eventually handing down the decision. 2 years probation, 300 hours of community service, and restitution, $47,000 paid back to the HOA. When the gavel came down, Linda just sat there staring at the table. All that effort to control a neighborhood, and it ended with her picking up trash along county highways. Meanwhile, Veronica and her husband quietly moved out of Pine Hollow Shores not long after that. No dramatic goodbye, no apology, just a moving truck one morning and an empty house by the weekend. And the lake? Well, the lake went back to being exactly what it had been before all the drama. Kids fishing, neighbors grilling, sunsets over the dock. The fence is still there, by the way. Perfectly straight line across the shoreline. Some people joked at first that it looked ridiculous, but after a while it just became part of the scenery. And honestly, it serves as a pretty good reminder. Because the lesson here isn't really about fences. It's about power. Small power, specifically. See, HOAs aren't inherently bad. Most of them exist for practical reasons. Maintaining shared spaces, preventing property disputes, keeping neighborhoods functional. But the system only works when the people running it remember one simple truth. They're stewards, not rulers. From a legal perspective, an HOA board is basically a management body operating within strict limits defined by property law and governing documents. The moment someone starts treating that role like personal authority over other people's property, that's when the whole structure breaks down. And there's another lesson here too. Because situations like this happen more often than you'd think. This is a psychological trap. Most communities rely on quiet compliance. Neighbors avoid conflict. People assume the board must know what it's doing. And when someone abuses that silence, the behavior grows. One rule turns into 10. One exception turns into favoritism. One small power trip becomes a full-blown control problem. But here's the funny part. The entire situation in our neighborhood didn't collapse because of some dramatic lawsuit or giant protest. It collapsed because someone read the documents. That's it. 30-year-old meeting minutes. Property surveys. A boring stack of paperwork nobody had bothered to look at. And once the facts were clear, the whole illusion of authority disappeared. Which brings me to the question I always wonder about with stories like this. What would have happened if nobody pushed back? Would the lakefront have slowly turned into someone's private backyard? Would more special exceptions have appeared? Would neighbors just quietly stop using the space altogether? Hard to say, but I do know this. Sometimes solving a problem doesn't require yelling, threats, or revenge. Sometimes it just requires drawing a line. And in my case, apparently that line happened to be a 6-foot cedar fence running straight through a dock. Now I'm curious what you think. If you lived in a neighborhood like this, would you have built the fence? Or would you have handled it differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because HOA stories are one of those things where everybody seems to have an opinion. And trust me, after living through this one, I'm pretty sure the next neighborhood drama is already brewing somewhere out there.